Hello everyone, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're going to explore something truly special, a quiet wedding that speaks volumes about loyalty, sacrifice, and the bonds that hold us together through life's toughest moments. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our upcoming videos. Let's dive in. The morning sunlight of the new year filtered through the window, falling onto James's hands as he carefully adjusted the small bow on little Nye's head. His movements were slow and familiar, as if repeated 1,000 times. Tu Diep stood beside him, her hands smoothing their daughter's hair, her eyes gently following every small detail. The room was quiet, filled only with the soft breathing of 3 people and the warm morning light. Little Nye looked up at her father, her clear eyes full of questions. "Daddy, where are we going today?" James bent down, a smile briefly appearing on his lips, his voice deep and warm. "We're going to a wedding, sweetheart. 2 friends who have helped Daddy very much." The answer was brief, without further explanation, but in his voice was a respect that only those who had been through difficulties could understand. Tu Diep looked at her husband, her hands still combing their daughter's hair, her heart feeling warm before this rare peace. After so much turmoil, after months of facing danger and instability, now they could prepare together for a simple morning, attending the wedding of good friends. That was the most precious thing. She remembered the sleepless nights waiting for James to return, the times she had to face fear alone, and also the moments when Sam was by her side, not needing to say much but enough to make her feel less alone. James was also thinking about Lee, about that disciplined man who hadn't hesitated to step forward when he needed help, even knowing it could put himself in danger. Little Nye was still curious. "Who are Uncle Lee and Aunt Sam, Daddy?" James gently stroked his daughter's head. "They're good people, honey. They helped Daddy and Mommy when we faced difficulties. Today is their happy day. We'll go congratulate them." Little Nye nodded. Though she didn't fully understand, she could sense the respect in her father's voice. Tu Diep pinned a small flower clip in her daughter's hair, then stood up, looking at their small family in the mirror. The 3 were dressed formally, but not elaborately. James in a simple gray suit, Tu Diep in a light pastel long dress, and little Nye in a pretty white flared dress. They looked like a normal family preparing for a special occasion, and that was exactly what they wanted, normalcy after abnormal times. The car rolled along the road leading to the city outskirts. James drove. Tu Diep sat beside him, and little Nye sat in the back, curiously looking out the window. The atmosphere in the car was peaceful, not needing many words. Sometimes James glanced at his wife. Tu Diep smiled back. They understood each other through the smallest gestures, through the comfortable silence between 2 people who had overcome so much together. The scenery on both sides of the road gradually changed from high-rise buildings to low houses, then to lush green fields. The sky was clear blue, without a single cloud, as if blessing Lee and Sam's important day. James thought about the first time he met Lee, when he was still a young police officer, full of enthusiasm, but also full of principles. They weren't close friends from the start, but through collaborations, through times of having to trust each other in dangerous situations, they had built a lasting friendship, not needing many words, but always solid. When the car turned onto the small road leading to the wedding venue, James immediately recognized the simplicity of this place. Not a luxurious hotel, not a restaurant bright with lights. This was a small garden, neatly tended with wooden chairs arranged in straight rows, with fresh flower pots placed on both sides of the aisle, and an open space under the blue sky. The aisle was covered with a simple white carpet, both sides with vases of white lilies and roses, not elaborate but elegant. At the end of the aisle was a small canopy decorated with white and light blue fabric strips, creating a solemn scene without ostentation. The space was cozy without being showy, solemn without being forced. This was exactly Lee's style, a disciplined man who didn't like fussiness. James held little Nye's hand. Tu Diep walked beside them, the three entering the garden. There weren't many guests, only about 30 to 40 people, mainly relatives, comrades, and close friends. James recognized some faces: police officers who had worked with Lee, a few old friends, and Tu Sam's family. There was no loud laughter, no bustle of typical weddings. Instead, there was a deep quietness, the understanding looks among people who had gone through the most difficult times together. Everyone was dressed formally, speaking to each other in gentle tones, creating a warm yet solemn atmosphere. James looked around, his eyes growing somber when he recognized a few familiar faces. People who had stood shoulder to shoulder in dangerous situations, people who didn't need to say much but always appeared at the right time. There was a tall man with gray hair talking with a middle-aged woman. He was the one who had shielded Lee in a dangerous case many years ago. There was a young couple smiling softly by the tea table. They were Tu Sam's close colleagues. Each person here had a story, a connection with the couple about to be married, and their presence wasn't out of social obligation, but genuine affection. Lee stood in the distance, talking with a few guests. When he saw James, he immediately walked over. The two men faced each other, no need for lengthy greetings. James extended his hand. Lee grasped it firmly. That handshake wasn't just a greeting, but an acknowledgement, gratitude, a friendship forged through real trials. Lee nodded slightly, a smile briefly appearing, then disappearing, like the habit of a man who rarely showed emotion. "Thank you for coming," Lee said, his voice deep and sincere. James replied, "There's no reason not to come. Today is your important day." Lee looked down at little Nye, standing beside James, bent down to her eye level. "You've grown so much." Little Nye smiled shyly, hiding behind her father. Lee stood up, his eyes slightly emotional. He thought about the future, about how perhaps one day he too would have a family like James's, have peaceful moments like this. Behind Lee, Tu Sam stepped out, wearing a simple white dress, without elaborate lace, just elegant lines that were just enough. The dress hugged lightly at the top, flared gently from the waist down, sleeves extending past the elbows, creating a graceful yet dignified appearance. Her hair was neatly pinned up, leaving only a few strands of bangs falling softly. No crown, no long veil, just a fresh flower tucked behind her ear. Tu Diep saw her, walked over, and the two women embraced. No questions about life, no perfunctory compliments, just a tight hug and understanding eyes. "You look beautiful," Tu Diep said, her voice sincere. Tu Sam smiled. "You too. Thank you for coming." The two women stood looking at each other. In the silence, memories came flooding back. Tu Sam had quietly helped Tu Diep during the most difficult times, when James had to face unforeseeable dangers. She didn't demand repayment, didn't ask about the future. She just did what needed to be done, like a true friend. The times Tu Diep called late at night, her voice trembling with worry, Tu Sam always listened, always encouraged, and sometimes just listening was enough to help Tu Diep get through the long night. James stood observing, brief flashbacks rising in his heart. He remembered the time Lee stepped up to support him in an extremely urgent matter, when everything could collapse in the blink of an eye. It was a case involving an organized crime gang, when James was being followed and his whole family's lives were threatened. Lee hadn't hesitated to use his authority, deploy protective forces, and even personally shadowed James during the most dangerous days. He didn't ask many questions, didn't demand explanations, just said one sentence: "Whatever you need, I'll do it." And he did exactly as promised. No showing off, no demanding credit, no mentioning it afterward. When everything was over, Ly just patted James's shoulder once, saying, "You and your family are safe. That's what matters." That was Ly's style. A police officer living by discipline and responsibility, not needing recognition but always doing what he believed was right. James also remembered Tu Sam, the woman who quietly helped Tu Diep maintain her spirit during the times James was away. Once, when James had to travel for work for a long time in a distant place, Tu Diep was home alone with little Nai, who was still small, feeling extremely pressured and lonely. Tu Sam came unannounced, just bringing a box of pastries and saying, "You shouldn't be alone. I'll stay with you for a few days." And she stayed, helping Tu Diep care for the child, cook, and most importantly, listening to the worries that Tu Diep couldn't share with anyone else. She didn't interfere too deeply, but was always present when needed. That was the most valuable kind of help. Not imposing, not demanding, simply being there. When James returned, Tu Diep told him about it, and he knew he owed Tu Sam a great deal. The ceremony began when gentle music sounded. A soft piano piece, not any traditional wedding song, but a self-selected melody, perhaps with special meaning to Ly and Tu Sam. Ly walked up to the altar, wearing his police dress uniform, his posture upright as had become familiar through so many years of work. The dark blue uniform pressed flat, the badges, the ribbons of honor worn neatly. Ly looked exactly like a soldier, serious, disciplined, trustworthy. But James noticed a small detail. Ly's hand slightly clenched, his thumb touching his palm, an unconscious gesture only close ones would recognize. It was a sign of tension, of emotions being restrained. Ly was a man of discipline, but today, before the altar, before this momentous decision, he was also an ordinary person with worries, emotions that couldn't be completely hidden. James looked at his friend with understanding. He knew that for someone like Ly, standing here before everyone expressing his emotions was not an easy act. Ly had lived the life of a police officer, always controlling emotions, always keeping a calm face, always being the one who shielded others. But today, he was allowing himself to be vulnerable, allowing himself to worry, and opening his heart to accept someone into his life completely. That was courage in a different way. Then Tu Sam walked forward. She walked out alone, without a father to lead her, without a group of bridesmaids following. Her father had passed away many years ago, and she decided she would walk to the person she loved on her own. Just her, wearing a simple white dress, holding a small bouquet of white roses and baby's breath, stepping steadily on the carpeted aisle. Her eyes were steady, looking straight at Ly. No radiant smile like typical brides, but there was determination, absolute trust in her decision. Each step she took was slow but firm. Tu Diep sat beside James, quietly observing, full of respect. She understood that Tu Sam had chosen the difficult path, loving a police officer, accepting days of waiting, accepting the worry each time he went out on duty. But she still walked forward, without hesitation. That was true love. Not the romantic love in movies, but the love of mature people, understanding responsibility and willing to bear it. When Tu Sam stood facing Ly before the altar, the entire space seemed to fall silent. No whispers, no sound disturbing this moment. The two looked at each other for a long time, in absolute silence. No need to smile much, no need to say anything. Just looking was enough. It was the silence of people who had paid the price for their choices, of people who understood the meaning of responsibility and sacrifice. In Ly's eyes was respect, was an unspoken promise. In Tu Sam's eyes was trust, was patience that had been tested through time. James sat in the front row, hand holding Tu Diep's hand, his heart overflowing with emotion. He remembered the times Ly had shielded him, the times Tu Sam had helped him stand firm when everything was shaking. This wasn't just the wedding of two friends, but also an opportunity for him to look back on his own journey. The journey from a lonely person to having a family, from someone fighting alone to having friends willing to stand beside him. He looked at Tu Diep, the woman who had accompanied him through so many ups and downs, and little Nai, their little daughter, the embodiment of everything they had built. He felt fortunate and felt grateful. Little Ni sat quietly, her big eyes observing everything. The ceremony was simple yet solemn, and though still young, she could sense this special atmosphere. In the middle of the ceremony, she held her father's hand, asking softly, "Daddy, is Uncle Lee scared?" James bent down, looking at his daughter, his voice deep and warm. "Yes, honey, he's scared, but he still stands there." Little Nai asked again, "Why doesn't he run away?" James smiled. "Because there are things more important than fear, sweetheart. Love is one of those things." Little Nai didn't fully understand, but nodded, then turned back to watch the altar. James knew that one day she would understand, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but standing firm despite fear. That love isn't without difficulties, but choosing to continue even knowing there are challenges ahead. That life isn't always easy, but there are people and things worth persevering for. The ring exchange ceremony began. A close friend of Lee's, also a police officer, stepped up as best man, handing Lee a small box containing the wedding ring. Lee's hand trembled slightly when receiving the box. He opened it, took out the simple platinum ring, not adorned with elaborate gems, just a few small patterns engraved inside. He tried to hold it steady but still couldn't hide his emotion. When he placed the ring on Tu Sam's hand, she gently held his hand steady, a simple gesture but full of meaning. Without words, Tu Sam had said everything, that she would be his support, that she would lift him up when he needed it. Lee looked at her, in his eyes a light that James had never seen in this friend before. It was the light of hope, of faith in the future. Tu Sam also placed the ring on Lee's finger, her movement slow, careful, as if sealing an eternal promise. The vows were spoken, not flowery sentences, not romantic promises like in movies. Lee said, his voice deep and serious, "You know my work is full of danger. I can't promise to always be safe, but I promise to always try to come back. I promise to love you with all my heart, in all circumstances, and will always put you and our family first in every decision." Tu Sam responded, her voice gentle but firm. "You know I've chosen this path. I promise to never turn my back, no matter how difficult. I promise to always wait for you, always believe in you, and will be the place you return to after each long day." Brief, honest, these were the vows of people who understood what responsibility meant, of people who didn't promise what they couldn't deliver. No promises about luxurious trips, no promises about a life without arguments, only promises about presence, about perseverance, about love overcoming all challenges. Applause rang out when the ceremony concluded, not loud, but warm, sincere. No fireworks, no grand performances, just steady applause, the quiet acknowledgement from people who understood and cherished the love they had just witnessed. Lee and Tu Sam turned around, hand in hand, walking down from the altar. They didn't kiss passionately, just a light kiss on the forehead, full of respect. Then they walked past each row of chairs, thanking each guest. When they reached James, Lee stopped. The two men looked at each other, no need for words. Tu Sam also bent down, hugging Tu Diep, the two women saying a few words no one else could hear, but both smiled. After the ceremony, there was a small reception held right in the garden. Several wooden tables were arranged in a U-shape, covered with simple white cloths, with small flower vases placed in the center. The food was also simple but carefully prepared. Family dishes, not delicacies, but full of flavor. Everyone sat down, chatted, shared stories about Ly and Tu Sam. The atmosphere was warm, intimate, more like a family gathering than a formal wedding reception. James was invited to speak. He stood before everyone, holding a microphone, silent for a few seconds before beginning. The afternoon sunlight fell, shining on his face, creating gentle shadows. "I'm not good at saying fancy words," he said, his voice deep and warm. "But I want to talk about friendship, about people who always appear at the right time, not because they want recognition, but because they know it's the right thing to do. Ly and Tu Sam are such people. They've helped me, helped my family in the most difficult times without asking for anything in return." He paused, looking toward Ly and Tu Sam sitting next to each other. "There are friends you can meet every day, laugh together, drink coffee together. But there are other friends, people you may not see often, but when you need them, they're there. No explanations needed, no reasons required. Ly is that kind of friend. He once stepped up when I was in danger, didn't ask many questions, just did what needed to be done. Tu Sam, too. She helped my wife get through the most difficult days, not with fanfare, just quietly being there." James looked down at little Nye sitting beside her mother, then looked back up. "Today, seeing them stand together, I believe they will continue to be support for each other, as they have been support for those around them. And I feel fortunate to witness this moment." He didn't name accomplishments, didn't detail the times he was helped, but everyone sitting here understood. Applause rang out again. Ly nodded, looking at James, his eyes grateful. Tu Sam also smiled softly, wiping away falling tears. The reception continued in a comfortable atmosphere. Someone sang a song, the voice not professional but sincere. Someone told funny stories about times Ly got into trouble for being too serious, making everyone laugh out loud. Tu Sam was also reminded by friends of old memories, when she was still a young girl full of dreams. No elaborate performances, no noisy games, just stories, laughter, and connections between people who truly cared about each other. When the reception was nearing its end, Ly separated from the crowd, walking to where James stood alone beside the garden, looking out at the distant fields. Without saying anything, Ly just patted James's shoulder once, firmly but gently. James turned around. The two men looked at each other. No need for words. Tu Sam also walked over, holding Tu Diep's hand, the two women standing beside the two men. "Thank you," Tu Sam said, her voice gentle. Just one sentence, but enough to say everything. Tu Diep smiled, holding her hand tighter. "We're all grateful to each other," she replied. Ly looked at James, then said, "You and your family always have a place in my home, anytime." James nodded. "I know. And you as well." It was a simple but solid promise, a commitment not needing papers, not needing legal vows, just trust. When James's family prepared to leave, the sky had begun to turn to sunset colors. The last rays of sunlight shone down, painting everything a warm golden color. James carried little Nye, who was tired after a long day, leaning her head on her father's shoulder, eyes closed. Tu Diep walked beside them, hand in hand with her husband. They walked out of the garden, turning back to wave goodbye to Ly and Tu Sam, who stood seeing off guests. No lengthy farewells, just waves and smiles. James knew they would meet again. No need to schedule, just when needed. On the way home, the car rolled smoothly. Little Nye had fallen asleep in the back seat. Tu Diep was also slightly tired, leaning her head against the window, watching the scenery outside pass by. James drove, his heart overflowing with a sense of peace. He looked at his daughter through the rearview mirror, then glanced at his wife. In his heart rose thoughts about life, about the meaning of happiness. He thought about the wedding just passed, about its simplicity yet sincerity. No extravagant performances, no unrealistic promises, just two people standing before each other, acknowledging their love and responsibility in the most honest way. That was true marriage. Not a party, not a happy day, but a decision to live together, face all challenges, and always choose to be beside each other. James spoke softly, as if talking to himself, but also wanting Tu Diep to hear. Happiness doesn't need to be loud, just the right people, at the right time. Tu Diep didn't open her eyes, but smiled, her hand reaching up to hold James's hand resting on the gear shift. "I know," she said softly. They didn't say anything more, letting silence fill the space. It was the comfortable kind of silence, of people who didn't need words to understand each other. The car continued rolling, the sunset gradually fading, giving way to nightfall. Houses began to turn on lights, creating small bright spots in the darkness. James thought about the future, about the days to come. He knew that life wouldn't always be smooth. There would still be difficulties, challenges, times of facing danger. But as long as Tu Diep was beside him, Little Ni in his arms, and friends like Lee and Tu Sam willing to stand on his side, he could face anything. True happiness wasn't anything grand or brilliant. It was simple moments like this: a beautiful day, a warm wedding, and a small family going home together in the sunset. It was simple but complete meals. Nights when Little Ni slept soundly in their arms. Times when Tu Diep smiled at him without saying anything. It was safety, trust, the presence of truly important people. James understood that he was luckier than many people. He had a family, trustworthy friends, and a life that, though not perfect, was full of meaning. When the car turned onto the road leading home, James felt his heart relax. Today was a good day. He had witnessed the love of two friends, been reminded of the value of friendship, and had another beautiful memory with his small family. That was all he needed, nothing more required. Just moments like these, and the belief that no matter what happened tomorrow, they would always be together, overcome all difficulties, and continue building this life one day at a time. The house lights came on when they arrived home. James turned off the engine, gently carried Little Ni out of the car. Tu Diep opened the door. The whole family stepped into the house. The familiar, warm space welcomed them. This was where they belonged, where they built each day, where they kept everything they cherished. James placed Little Ni on the bed, gently stroking her hair. Tu Diep stood beside them, watching their daughter sleep, then looking at her husband. They smiled at each other, no need to say anything. Then they went downstairs together, sat on the sofa, hand in hand, in the silence of a day ending and faith in the days to come. That was happiness, simple, honest, and eternal. James, Tu Diep, and Little Ni attend the wedding of two close friends, Officer Lee and Tu Sam, whose quiet support helped their family survive the most dangerous times. The ceremony is simple yet profound, held in a modest garden with only close friends and family present. As Lee stands in his police uniform and Tu Sam walks down the aisle alone, their vows are honest rather than romantic, promises of presence, perseverance, and love that transcends danger. James reflects on how Lee once protected his family from organized crime, while Tu Sam stayed beside Tu Diep through endless, anxious nights. The wedding reminds them that true happiness isn't found in grand gestures, but in the quiet loyalty of people who appear exactly when needed. It's a celebration of mature love, unshowy, steadfast, and built to last through whatever comes next.